Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Let's head down to Washington, D.C. Let's talk a little bit of policy here. And we can do that with Nathan Dean. He's a Bloomberg Intelligence senior policy analyst. Nathan, what's the feeling in D.C. as the rest of the country starts going to the polls here? Any smart money leaning one way or the other, or is it, as most folks suggest, really too close to call at this point?
So I think it's too close to call in the presidential race and then the House race. I think essentially I could tell you who I think is going to win, but then I have to give you a 5-minute explanation. And if I do that, I'm not really explaining anything. But what we can say is that we generally think the Republicans are going to take the Senate. Why? This is a very difficult race for the Democrats. They're defending 23 out of the 34 seats out there. Senator Joe Manchin is resigning. The Republicans are going to most likely take West Virginia. They could potentially take Montana as well. You know, Senator John Tester is not doing so well there in the polling wise. But why does that matter? Well, it means that if President Trump wins, a deregulatory effort can happen much quicker. And if Kamala Harris wins, it means the Republicans can effectively block or jam up a lot of her nominees for their own regulatory efforts. But just on the main thing of who's going to win the race, we're going to have to wait until tonight.
What are the implications for investors here and for markets? You know, what kind of results could we be hearing in the next few days that would move the market, or that investors would need to know about?
Yeah, so we were trying to think of like the major catalysts of what happens if you get a Harris victory versus a Trump victory. The first one is tariffs. I mean, we think that the tariffs are going to come no matter who wins the president next year, but is it a broad tariff, 60% on all goods coming from China, or a very small subset? So once you decide, or once we figure out who the president is, we'll know what the tariff outlook looks like for next year. The other thing is investment banks. If Kamala Harris wins, the Basel III Endgame, a rule that increases capital about 9% for the banks, will most likely go forward. If President Trump wins, that's not going to happen. The Inflation Reduction Act, mostly cemented if Kamala Harris wins, could be tweaked. So if you have exposure to renewables and the renewables industry, that's something to keep in mind. And then the last thing is that if the Republicans have a great night and take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, then the opportunity for reconciliation for massive tax reform next year, think multi-trillion-dollar tax reform at the tail end of 2025, that comes to play if the Republicans have a great night.
If former President Trump were to win, what would he do on day one? Would he be just doing tariffs across the board? Because that is something that a president can do.
Yeah, so, President Trump, if you look at the executive orders, now our view is that I'd say about 85% of executive orders are symbolic in nature. It's a fancy way of the president picking up the phone and directing to his or her staff, do something either the legislative route or the regulatory route. But the power of the presidency is more powerful in that other 15%, and that's national security, foreign relations, tariffs, and trade. Now, Congress has largely delegated tariffs to the president, and there's some thought out there that President Trump would need congressional authorization. Our view is that there's a lot that he could do unilaterally, and so if President Trump comes in day one, expect those executive orders to come out. Now, when it comes to a tariff, I think you would see the red line come across the Bloomberg terminal and say, President Trump signs executive order on tariff. Within the language of that tariff executive order, though, there'd be language essentially saying this won't go into fruition for another 270 days or 365 days. Why? It's a negotiation tool, and presidents don't want to back themselves up into corners. They want the flexibility to see what the reciprocal tariff would look like before it actually goes into fruition. So there's a little bit of headline risk there, but the ultimate impact of a tariff, if President Trump wins, would probably be in the second or third quarter of next year.
And Nathan, what are you going to be watching for policy-wise with the lame duck president if we do find out a winner, let's say, this week or even next week?
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're talking about lame duck, but Congress comes back next week. And so there are a couple of things that the lobbyists around town are all loving to see if they can get this attached. Because remember, we have a government funding fight coming up in December. Now, there's two things that we're really looking on. First is stablecoins. Now, there's this idea that there's a stablecoin bill that get passed during the lame duck. I may be a little bit out of consensus. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to push the can to 2025 because lame ducks are always optimistic from the lobbyist perspective. But when the reality hits and most people just want to go home because the election's over, they usually don't tend to have much outs there. The other thing I would just note is Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois will most likely try to reattach what's bill called the Credit Card Competition Act. If you've flown through LaGuardia, Newark, you may have seen the ads about this bill taking away credit card points associated with airlines and so forth like this. This would open up competition in terms of networks on credit cards. again, some headline risk there. I don't think it's going to happen, though. I think, again, they'll get kicked to 2025, but certainly something we have to pay attention to.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Nathan Dean, he's a senior policy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's down there in Washington, D.C. He and his team, they really focus on policies coming out of Congress and which industries, and maybe even down to the company levels, which will be impacted. And that's the research that he and his team do, and it's widely valued by Bloomberg customers because we know many industries are heavily regulated and dependent upon government policy. So it's good to have Nathan Dean and his team down there in D.C.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Let's get back to this election here. Henrietta Treyz has been a valued source for us, all things politics here for a long time. We appreciate getting a few minutes of her time. She's a managing partner and director of economic policy at Veda Partners. Henrietta, we've got early votes. Is there anything we can glean from early voting? And if so, which states should we kind of look at?
Yeah, we do have early votes. I think there's really only 2 states that I'd feel comfortable saying are giving us strong indications right now. And they're both very promising for Donald Trump, I think, in Nevada and in North Carolina. The early vote turnout, the Get Out the Vote initiative that the Trump campaign has embraced this year, unlike the last cycle, is really for in-person early voting. And both states have done that in droves. And we're seeing that sort of nationwide in all the early voting. A lot of rural Republican voters have turned out at much larger numbers than we saw either in 2022 or in 2020. So his supporters are definitely getting the email and the memo about getting out there early.
So does that change your forecast at all for who actually is going to win the Electoral College? Because if I'm reading the notes, your most recent forecast was that President or Vice President Harris would actually win the Electoral College.
That's right. So the early vote is telling me that the Electoral College map that I have passed out for each candidate is still holding strong and looks correct. So I expect Donald Trump to win Nevada. I expect Donald Trump to win North Carolina and Georgia. The last 2 are pickups. Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada are all pickups for Donald Trump this year that I'm expecting, and that's what early voting is showing. There's a lot of different opinion out there. John Ralston, who is excellent in Nevada, is saying that Kamala Harris is going to win by 0.3% in Nevada. And of course, Democrats have eked out wins in the state of Nevada for the last 2 cycles. And that's based off of sort of the legacy of the Harry Reid machine. And Jackie Rosen continues to pull well ahead of her competitor in the state at the Senate level. What you're seeing in Nevada and Arizona is actually that 15% of the Republican constituency in those 2 states are voting for the Democratic Senate candidate. So if there's crossover that early vote can't pick up, I don't know how you voted. I just know that you did vote. If there's crossover amongst Republicans into the Harris camp, that is that's going to be a surprise that is not registered either in the polls, which are finding everything sort of neck and neck. And it's not going to be something that we know from the early vote because we don't know how you voted. So that could be a shift that we see on election night. But my expectation is that they both go for Trump. But overarchingly, I still anticipate that Harris will win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and that gets her 270 electoral college votes. And that's why my odds are 60% that she will win.
Interesting. Henrietta, we had a poll come out in the last couple of days from the state of Iowa. That was surprising for a lot of people, showing that Vice President Harris leading in that state, which typically is a Republican state. What did you make of that poll, and what does that tell you?
It really reinforces the story of this election cycle. There's been a tremendous amount of focus on the Black and Latino youth vote, and specifically the youth male vote, and how there's been a draw away from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party. What I think that whole conversation has missed is that the story of elections is really the suburbs. The suburbs vote the most. They are the arbiters of the election cycle. So in 2016, they swung 4 points for Donald Trump. In 2020, they swung 2 points for Joe Biden, and they decided the outcome of the election. Right now, in critical states like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia suburbs are going strongly for Kamala Harris. And so the story of the Seltzer poll, I thought was fascinating, that 23% of the Iowa voters in the suburbs plus 23 for Kamala Harris. that's an indicator that the suburb story is correct. And I think we can translate that nationwide. I don't expect Kamala Harris to win Iowa, but the story of the suburbs is what I really want to focus on when I see that poll and then transcribe to swing states.
How have each candidate's kind of catered towards that suburban vote? Are there certain issues that you study that resonate more with the suburban voters that the candidates have been, I guess, trying to touch on?
Democracy, this concept of democracy being on the ballot is a really big deal in the suburbs. They think that issue is critical. And then beyond that, you have abortion that Democrats try to hammer home. And on the right, you have immigration. It's really those top three issues. The economy is important, but it's such a misleading or misguiding polling question these days because your view of the economy is mostly defined by whether you support Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Biden's administration or Trump on the campaign trail. So if you side with either of those two parties, that dictates your view of how the economy is going. I think now that inflation has been tamped down and gas prices are back well below their 2022 levels and are down now to $3 or less nationwide on average, it's a opportunity for the two campaigns to talk about other issues besides just the economy. And we see abortion, immigration leading, and then democracy in these suburbs is really critical.
Henrietta, some are suggesting that we may not know the winner of the presidential race for days. Isn't that in and of itself a problem for the U.S.? Shouldn't our country with our technology be able to know almost in real time kind of how the voting's going? I just don't understand why it feels like our system is so antiquated.
I completely agree. And I think it's a great point to make right now. Why can't we start counting ballots the second that they start coming in? You know, I think that's a little frustrating. So you have a state like Pennsylvania where all these poll workers, and they have so many this year that are, really doing the Lord's work. They're early, they're expanding voting hours, and they are, ready to put those ballots through the machine to have them read. We should definitely be capable of starting that early. They had the opportunity in the last couple of years with all these different refinements in the ballot process and collecting and changing of laws. Like we've seen in Georgia, for example, they're going to start reporting out different county data at 8 p.m., which is going to be one of our first arbiters of how the night is going. But I completely agree. I wish they could move this along.
Yep, interesting. I'm sure some kid in garage out in Palo Alto could come up with an app in a day. Henrietta Treyz, thank you so much for joining us. Henrietta has been so helpful to us during this whole election process. She's a managing partner and director of economic policy at Veda Partners. She is down there in New Orleans, I believe, in Louisiana is where she's based.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Emily Graffeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Complete coverage of this election throughout the day. Markets trading higher, as John was just reporting. Let's check in with Jennifer Lawless. She's a professor at the University of Virginia. Did you arrange this? Is this your doing?
This was a pleasant surprise.
Very good. Emily Graffeo is also a proud graduate of the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville. Jennifer, what are you looking for today? What should our listeners, our viewers, what should they be paying attention to today?
Well, the most important thing is that every listener who hasn't already cast a ballot go out and vote. And looking at the length of those lines, just getting a sense of the enthusiasm at the polling places, I think will at least let people know whether this is going to be a high turnout election or not. But we're really not going to know anything until this evening when the polls close, and the early signs will be in North Carolina and Georgia.
What are we hearing so far? Or how are you understanding the closing messages from both candidates? I know that Trump is set to speak at 11 a.m.
Perhaps. It's uncertain.
Okay.
It's uncertain, so we'll see.
But what are we understanding right now, Professor Lawless, about the closing messages from both candidates?
Well, it seems to me that the closing messages for the Harris campaign are the messages that she's been conveying for the last 90 or 100 days. She's been very disciplined and on script. And that's basically that it's time to turn a new page. If people want new leadership, if they want a new generation, if they want new policies, Kamala Harris is the way forward. And Donald Trump is basically trying to make the case that the Biden-Harris administration broke it and he can fix it. It's a challenge for him, obviously, both because he has a hard time staying on message, but also because he's been president already. So he's trying to portray himself as the change candidate, and she's trying to portray him as the incumbent.
Jennifer, how long are we going to have to wait, do you believe, for the presidential election to be called? I mean, this is going to be a dicey situation from what we understand because of some of the mail-in ballotings and just because it's so close.
It's difficult to know, but if Harris performs well or wins in North Carolina or Georgia, it's hard to see a Trump victory. And then we would likely know early. We would probably know by tomorrow. If Donald Trump wins in North Carolina and Georgia, both of which are states that he's been actively campaigning in and Republicans typically win, then it could go on for a lot longer because we're going to have to wait for all of the counting in Pennsylvania and perhaps Arizona, both of which are notoriously slow and don't start counting until late.
You have written a number of books that have to do with gender and politics. And I'm wondering, when you look at this presidential race, to what extent has gender played a role? Have you been surprised, I guess, maybe about the lack of gender roles? At least it seems like Vice President Harris has not played up as much that she is a woman running, and she has perhaps brought up other issues a little bit more. But I'm wondering what you think.
That's right. Kamala Harris has not played into the breaking the glass ceiling. She would be the first woman in the White House narrative that we saw very prominently featured in the 2016 campaign of Hillary Clinton. But gender is still very, very significant this election cycle. Not only do we have a substantial gender gap where women are more likely than men to prefer Harris and men are significantly more likely than women to prefer Trump, but the issues on the agenda have also been speaking specifically to gendered roles and gendered concerns. And so the Harris campaign, for example, has really been highlighting reproductive rights and freedom and abortion rights and what a Trump administration would mean for women's bodily autonomy. And the Trump campaign has basically seeded a lot of those female swing voters and has tried very, very hard to motivate young men, especially those between the ages of 18 and 29, to come out and vote under this threat of their country being taken away from them. So even though the sex of the candidate hasn't been as prominently featured in the campaign narratives, the issues and the vying for male versus female voters has been on high display.
Jennifer, below the presidential election, down ballot, what are the key races for you?
The key Senate races to watch are John Tester in Montana. If he somehow manages to hold on, then it's going to be a very good night for the Democrats. And Colin Allred vying against Ted Cruz in Texas. If Allred manages to knock out Ted Cruz, that would be the shocker of the night. It's likely that the Senate will go Republican, but there are a couple of indicators that could be harbingers of success for Democrats.
So what does a professor of politics at the University of Virginia do on election night? Do you stay up all night and hope that a decision comes in, or do you just go to sleep and know that this is going to take a while? Because I'm wondering, like, what we should all be doing.
Well, I committed to you guys for 5:10 a.m. tomorrow morning, so a lot of sleep will not be had. But yeah, I mean, it's basically the election day is where it all comes to an end. There's nothing to do anymore. There's nothing to watch. There are no events. There are no final, strategies to assess. This is it. And so once the returns start coming in, it's just a matter of watching and trying to analyze the results of the exit polls that are released and getting a better sense of where the numbers are. But if we look back to 2020, I don't think I slept for 5 days. The winner wasn't announced until Saturday. So it's just a matter of watching those ticking screens the same way that everybody else does and trying to figure out what's going on. But I would tell people that, if Harris doesn't win North Carolina or Georgia early, they can go to sleep because we're not going to know tonight.
All right. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer Lawless, she's a professor at the University of Virginia, joining us from Charlottesville via Zoom.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Emily Graffeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here from our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience, streaming live on YouTube as well. All right, swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. Do we just look at the states, or do we drill down even more to maybe local towns or local counties and to see how this thing is going to go? I have no idea, but our next guest does. David Paleologos, director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University, joining us from Boston, Mass, via that Zoom thing. David, again, we know the swing states. Do you go even more granular to look at certain parts of the states, certain towns? How do you do it?
Yeah, we do, and we've gone mainstream with the bellwether model. Of the bellwethers are areas that correctly predict where the statewide vote is going to go. I just tweeted a list in the swing states of what counties or cities to take a look at. But the first three states that you mentioned, Paul, are really the ground zero: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. According to a lot of the aggregator models, they have Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina tacking toward Trump. So that puts a lot more pressure on those three Rust Belt states. And within those states, we're looking at specific counties, as you say.
And what makes a county worthy of an extra eye? I know that you've written Northampton, Erie in Pennsylvania, Kent in Michigan. What specifically about those counties makes them worthy of watching so closely?
So it's a proprietary model, but generally speaking, what we look for is, does the county flip when the state flips, or vice versa, from Democrat to Republican back to Democrat, A, and B, when it does flip, does the county vote as close to perfect accurately reflect what the actual percentages were when the flip happened? So it has to not only just flip, it can't flip 60-40 and it'll be a 2% flip on the state. It has to be, if it flips and it shows a candidate winning by 3 or 4, the state should show the same. So, and there are a bunch of other indices that we use in our screening process. But those counties, when you're watching tonight and you're hovering your mouse over the map and you're looking at your own sort of prediction of how the states are going to vote, Northampton and Erie have been remarkably prescient in terms of predicting the statewide outcomes in Pennsylvania, as has Kent and Door County in Michigan and Wisconsin, respectively.
David, our last guest had their prediction, I guess Harris 270 electoral votes, Trump 268. Do you guys at Suffolk have a similar type of prediction, or are you not in that business?
So we don't model. We do poll, and we give our information out to the public, and it's consumed by aggregators like Nate Silver and 538 and Charlie Cook and Larry Sabato.
Yep.
And they take our information with others, and they run their own models. But it's a really close race, and I can tell you that just by virtue of polling some of these bellwether areas. And what I'll be looking at, though, is maybe a little bit different. I'm going to be looking at New Hampshire first off, because we're going to get New Hampshire numbers fairly quickly, and it's got an evenly balanced party affiliation. And Biden won on New Hampshire in 2020 by 7.5 points. Kamala Harris wins by between 6 and 9 points. No need to worry about New Hampshire. But if she wins by 12 or 10 in New Hampshire, that signals to me that independents who really make up the undecideds are swinging blue, and you could see that reverberate across the country. If Harris only wins by 1, 2, or 3, or loses New Hampshire, I think the opposite could be true. You could see Trump carrying in some of those other states. So I'm going to keep a little bit of an eye on New Hampshire and how those results are coming in. And I've also listed a couple of the bellwether towns in New Hampshire. Hampton is one of them, in Jaffrey, New Hampshire.
I know it's so hard to tell right now, but what is your sense for just how long the counting is going to take and how many days we'll have to wait to see when these results come out?
Maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think we're going to be pleasantly surprised. I think, there's a lot of trust in our national poll of local precinct wardens. People have a lot of trust in their own local community's ability to process and count votes. And I think they don't want to lose that trust. And so I think they're taking great pains to try and improve the efficiency of their own operations. They improved a little bit in 2022. I think they'll do a little bit better. I hope it doesn't carry on for days and weeks. And I think, I think we're going to have at least due diligence on the part of the counting process as best we can. So I'm hopeful that it will only be a day tops or two, not weeks.
David, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate getting your perspective. David Paleologos, Director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University. Again, they're one of the sources for a lot of this polling data for the folks that are in the business of making predictions. So we'll see how it goes. But again, the message has been very clear. Too close to call here. So I'll be interested to see how the networks handle it this evening in terms of kind of what we've been. I kind of grew up with, you kind of knew this stuff by 9 or 10 o'clock, and networks were making the call, and I'm not sure we're in that environment this year.
It's so interesting to see just how carefully these pollsters and these, I guess, data scientists zoom in to counties. It's just really incredible.
And what's also incredible is, I don't know, we'll have to see how accurate they are or not coming forward.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It is Emily Graffeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, and we're streaming live on YouTube as well. So check us out there at Bloomberg Podcast is where you can go search for us. Every cycle, every election cycle, it seems to one of the key issues is always it's the economy. Focus on the economy. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, and so on and so forth. Our next guest thinks about that stuff as well. Christopher Smart, managing partner at Arbroath Group and former special assistant to the president for international economics, joining us from Boston, Massachusetts via that Zoom thing. Christopher, how, again, too close to call, we get all of that. How are you kind of framing out this election and kind of the risks and opportunities just from an economic policy perspective?
Well, I think as you were mentioning earlier, the market really does focus also, by the way, on the economics. And weirdly, as all of our political tools to predict the outcome of this election seem to be failing us today, the economic data seems like it's actually painting a pretty consistent picture. Good growth, low unemployment, inflation coming down, rates we'll find out Thursday, but money likely to become cheaper. And that, I think, more than anything explains what's going on in the market overall. I think what's also a little bit strange is that, in one way, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or tonight. But in another way, neither outcome is going to be a huge surprise for the market the way it was, for example, in 2016 when President Trump first won against Hillary Clinton. And so I guess, with some certainty about who the next president is going to be, we hope we find that out tonight or tomorrow. That should lead the market to rally a little bit, but I'm not sure we could expect a big move one way or the other, except in some of these key so-called Trump trades, either rising or falling depending on the outcome.
Christopher, to what extent do you think prediction markets and I guess the rise of betting on the outcome of the election have somehow changed this election versus what we have seen in prior races? What role have those prediction markets played here?
I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer yet. I mean, I think we need to sort of see these markets develop over a couple of cycles. I'm not sure I believe, that they are great predictors of the outcome. I mean, you've seen actually them moving with the polls to some extent as President Trump's momentum seems to have flagged of late. You've seen some of those things tighten. You've seen the Bitcoin trade come off, except for today. You've seen the peso bounce a little bit as Vice President Harris's odds appear to be improving in the polls. So I think we'll be looking at those markets more closely in terms of how deep they are, who's participating, who's got the really big bets on, are they big enough to actually move those numbers? But I think they're kind of interesting, but maybe not, going to move a lot of money one way or the other.
Chris, I hear a lot about the Trump trade. Is that anything more than, long the dollar, short bonds? Is that a reasonable way to think about it, or is it a little more nuanced than that?
I think that's very well. It's more nuanced in when you dig down into clean energy stocks versus oil stocks. When you look at, for example, retailers that are very sensitive to tariffs, they are the anti-Trump trade versus banks that are probably less sensitive to tariffs and maybe hoping for some deregulation. So within certain sectors, I think you get a differentiation. But I think overall, there is a sense that a Trump presidency will, ironically for Republicans over the past number of years, be the less fiscal hawkish administration. And so that is a trade where, if he wins, the expectation is more inflation, a bigger budget deficit, maybe higher tariffs with, higher prices with tariffs, and a crackdown on immigration. That I think is what captures it all in terms of what you're seeing in bond yields as well as maybe stock prices.
How much do you anticipate the FOMC meeting and the Fed decision on Thursday to drive markets when it comes during, such a pivotal week for the future of the U.S. presidency?
Well, I think a lot of us have forgotten that there was an FOMC meeting this week. With all apologies to Jerome Powell, he may appreciate the fact that the spotlight won't be so glaring on him on Thursday. I think the Fed has done an extraordinary job through an election cycle, through a very partisan period in our history, to really focus on its own knitting, really focus on the data, really focus on when it feels that it can bring interest rates down. And other than a few partisan voices on one side or the other, I think the markets don't believe that this is a partisan move on their part. And I think that's why they have, really tried to make sure they are delivering that message. And I think that's what most people believe.
All right, Christopher, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Christopher Smart, he is a managing partner at Arbroath Group and a former special assistant to the president for international economics, joining us from Boston.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.